So it's time for us to have a talk about Brunei, because this has been a developing story over the last few days in the British media about the Sultan of Brunei, or the government of Brunei, has recently passed a law just a few days ago that gay sex and adultery, for the purposes of being all covering, are now punishable by death, specifically by stoning in Brunei. And this has led to public outcry across the West, across America and across Britain. And it's led to celebrities setting up boycotts of certain hotels in London, prestigious like top level hotels in London that are owned by the Sultan of Brunei, in an attempt to boycott these hotels and potentially sort of cause him some sort of financial harm. Now, how much harm you're going to cause a man worth $20 billion is questionable, but it's everyone's right to protest and boycott anything they disagree with. So that's not what I'm going to talk about today. What it seems to be is this seems to be a perfect example of exceptionalism in the West, and how the Western governments, particularly America and Britain, they ignore certain behaviours from certain governments when those governments are their friends or their allies or their business partners. For instance, Saudi Arabia, where being gay is punishable by death, where loads of things are punishable by death or whipping or imprisonment that wouldn't be punishable by wouldn't be punishable, period, in any sort of Western civilized society. I use that term loosely, civilized, what we would consider civilized in any sort of progressive society. For instance, if you go to Saudi Arabia and you so much as hold your wife's hand, or you kiss your wife on the forehead in public, or she's not wearing a full face veil, or any display of affection, you and your partner and your wife are thrown in jail. If you're living in Saudi Arabia and you're espousing atheistic beliefs online, you will be publicly flogged, which has happened quite recently actually. Or if you're a Christian, you can be publicly flogged. Or basically, if you deviate from their interpretation of Sharia law, you can be publicly flogged, thrown in jail, or executed. If you're a thief, doesn't matter what the reason. Doesn't matter why you're a thief. Doesn't matter if you're a bank robber or you're just nicking fruit from a fruit and veg store in Saudi Arabia. You can have your hand cut off. These are just some of the barbaric practices and rules in Saudi Arabia. But the UK very, very rarely mentions that. It's only mentioned in a few sort of activist groups and charitable organisations. They're the only people that really talk about it, and certain politicians on the left. But other than that, no one talks about this sort of thing in Saudi Arabia. Why? Because money talks. Money talks. If you've got a government that has enough money to buy British arms and American arms, has enough money to invest in British business and buy British business, the Saudis own Sainsbury's, as a matter of fact. If you've got all that money that you can invest in British business and you can contribute to the British economy, then Britain will ignore your crimes against humanity, often your crimes against human rights. No matter how barbaric you are, no matter how evil you are, how cruel and how unfair, and no matter how much injustice is in your legal system, Britain and America will largely ignore it. We see this in Saudi Arabia, we see it in Israel, we see it in a number of countries that the UK and the US do business with. But Brunei does have business interest in the UK, I will grant you. They're nowhere near the level of Saudi Arabia. And that is why we now have this system, this situation where people are publicly criticising the Sultan of Brunei for this recent law that was just recently passed that means gay sex and adultery are punishable by death by stoning. So I want to talk about that because it's, again, as I say, it's a case of selective outrage, selective exceptionalism, where you can ignore one country's crimes because they've got more money. And I want to talk about the interpretation of Sharia law in some of these countries as well, because Saudi Arabia is very interesting, as is Brunei, because these countries often, they interpret Sharia law as, what they want it to be. I've spoken to Muslims who think Sharia law, the first rule of Sharia law is you should obey the laws of the country you are residing in, regardless of whether that's a Muslim or a non-Muslim country. I've spoken to Muslims who have said Sharia law includes not compelling others to follow Islam, not forcibly converting people, who think Sharia law is very, very peaceful. That's their interpretation. Saudi Arabia and Brunei think Sharia law is very brutal, very totalitarian. They think atheism and homosexuality and sex outside of marriage are punishable crimes, punishable by death or stoning or imprisonment. But it's interesting because if you go to Saudi Arabia, you can gamble like a bastard. You can get loads of prostitutes, you can gamble, you can drink, you can do what you want. But you can't have gay sex, you can't kiss your wife in public, and you can't even get a bacon fucking sandwich. It's mad how they just cherry pick. The same with Brunei. You go to Brunei, you can drink in all their hotels in London. You can presumably get a full English breakfast with bacon in all their hotels in London. But I'm assuming they allow unmarried couples to stay overnight in their hotels in a bed together in London. It's interesting how these countries cherry pick what they want, what they believe Sharia law to be, and then interpret it. So Brunei deserves unequivocal, 100% total condemnation for their recent laws. No doubt about it. But let's not forget some of the relationships that the UK and the US have with countries who follow similar practices. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.